ماشي، انا Hello, everyone. Why don't you start to get your seats, and we will get started in just a minute. Okay. I think I'm getting the thumbs up sign to get started. My name is Sarah Charles. I lead USAID's Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, and I'm really thrilled to be here today to moderate this panel on the nexus between nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. I understand there was a very good and lively panel here immediately before this one on adaptation financing for nature-based solutions. So going from kind of that broader look at adaptation financing to specifically on the ground how this nexus between nature-based solutions and disaster risk reduction. We have a wonderful panel here today. They're each going to give a few remarks. We may also be joined a little bit later in the panel by the Minister of Environment from Zambia, who's in the middle of negotiations right now and very understandably maybe popping in a little bit late. I also just want to flag that we will hopefully have some time for question and answer from the audience. So please be prepared with questions for this esteemed panel. I think we've long recognized the role that nature-based solutions have to play in addressing climate impacts and mitigating against climate impacts. But there's a growing recognition internationally, frankly, a recognition that indigenous communities have had for a long time about the role that nature-based solutions have in mitigating the loss of life, the loss of livelihoods as a result of climate impacts. And so we here today are going to talk specifically about how partnership can really drive solutions in this space. It's nice to be here towards the end of COP actually talking about solutions and really looking forward. I think we know, of course, that degradation can be an underlying and contributing factor to human vulnerability, perpetuating the disaster cycle and impeding adaptation and climate-related disasters and disaster response. I was in the Philippines earlier this year, where USAID has long partnered with the government and with local communities on not only disaster response, but disaster risk reduction. And I think in the Philippines, you have really stark examples. When Typhoon Haiyan hit more than 10 years ago, 5,000 people killed as a result of really a mega cyclone at the time. But even with that horrific loss of life, you saw extreme variability in where that loss of life hit. Sometimes directly dependent not on the strength of the storm or even the strength of the storm surge, but because of where mangrove forest existed. And we really saw kind of up close how protection of the environment, how mangrove forests could not just save lives, but as importantly, save livelihoods. And experience tells us again that we need to look at nature-based solutions through the entire continuum of disaster risk reduction and response. It's one of the reasons why when USAID was developing its new climate strategy, which was rolled out last year at Glasgow, nature-based solutions was one of the key 5 foundational principles as part of our strategy. We also know and have seen again and again that indigenous communities have this understanding. They have for generations used nature-based solutions to mitigate the risk of disasters. And it's one of the reasons, again, why USAID, as we look to supercharge our investments in locally led adaptation solutions, we're really looking at how to support indigenous knowledge as part of that continuum of support for nature-based solutions. A big piece of our support for nature-based solutions is investment in partnership with organizations that we see here today. I'm really looking forward to hearing from our panelists about a very exciting partnership between WWF and IFRC, a partnership that USAID has been an early investor in and an early supporter of. And without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce our panelists here today. Again, very pleased to be here with Marco Lambertini, the Director General of the World Wildlife Fund for Nature International. Nina Stolijovic, Undersecretary General for Global Relations, Diplomacy, and Digitalization at the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Society. Very excited to see Dr. Asha Mohammed, who I last saw in Nairobi a few months ago, here representing the Kenyan Red Cross Society, and also on the board of the IFRC, as I understand it. And Valerie Hickey, the Global Director of Environment, Natural Resources, and the Blue Economy for the World Bank, certainly a very critical actor in this space. Maybe if we could start with you, Marco, to really lay out for us this vision of partnership that WWF is taking forward.
Well, thank you very, very much, and thank you everybody for for joining us today. Look, I can only think of one word to define our partnership with IFRC. Very exciting, and I'm very excited for two reasons, really. One, because this is happening at a very, very important time for our society, for our civilization, I would dare to say. It is a moment in our history unprecedented, because on one hand, we are driving towards tipping points entire Earth systems that have been the foundation of our safety, prosperity, and development. From climate, but also through nature loss, the loss of biodiversity, forest, ocean, freshwater systems. But that's not very exciting. This is quite terrifying. But what is exciting is that for the first time in our history, we are also understanding, or rather beginning to understand, the impacts that these losses, the destabilization of climate, the loss of ecosystems, is actually having, and is going to have increasingly, on our lives. And so the conservation of nature, try to avoid climate change, is something that is not just any longer a moral duty in order to coexist with the rest of life on Earth. It's actually an imperative for our safety in the not too distant future. And that's amazing, because this is a real cultural shift. After decades, centuries of taking nature for granted, we're beginning to understand that actually our economic development, our social stability, the protection of the most vulnerable sectors in society, our well-being, our health, and particularly all this of our children and their children, depends on healthy nature, on stable natural systems. And that's why I'm excited, because the two agendas, nature conservation, that was all about pandas and tigers and elephants until recently, and the humanitarian development agenda are really now violently agreeing with each other. And that's why an organization like WWF, with the panda as a logo, and an organization like IFRC, with the Red Cross, which is about rescue and relief, have decided to come together.
You know, Nina, Marco spoke about why this is exciting for WWF. conservation is obviously in the DNA of WWF, but as Marco mentioned, when people think about the International Federation of the Red Cross, Red Crescent societies, when they think about the national societies, they think about people running in after a disaster strikes. Could you speak a little bit to why this partnership is exciting for IFRC, why IFRC sees the value of nature-based solutions, conservation approaches, and the work that you're doing?
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I just wanted to respond to Marco's excitement with our excitement as well, to have such a prominent partner with us at this critical moment where at this particular COP we are talking about solutions, we are talking about implementation, we are talking about projectization of all the climate commitments and all the billions that have been mentioned. As you know, and Sarah hinted that I represent, and Dr. Asha also, an organization which is the largest humanitarian network in the world. We are present in every single country in the world, in 192 countries, in millions of communities. Some of them are very hard to reach. And we take a pride of that. And when you look at the lives in those communities and what happens when typhoon that you mentioned, Sarah, or the floods in Pakistan happen, or the drought in Africa, those communities are the most vulnerable. So we realize that the same volunteers who live in those communities before, during, and after disaster, they can do quite a lot of work on nature-based solutions for their communities. And it is not just stepping in when the disaster comes, but also helping those communities to become more resilient to climate disasters. And as we know, 85% of all disasters in the world are climate disasters. Therefore, in this partnership with WWF, we want to create a link between nature-based solutions and disaster risk reduction and response, to make the world understand what it is, and also to understand what this network, with such a strong presence in local communities, can do in implementing, in solving the problem that we are talking about. So that's where my excitement is, Sarah, and I would be happy to talk a little bit about financing later on.
Dr. Asha, when we think about climate impacts here at COP, I think the drought, the unprecedented fifth failed rains in northern Kenya, Somalia, and Ethiopia, possibly a sixth failed rain around the corner, looms incredibly large when we're having these conversations here at COP. When you think about the nexus between nature-based solutions and humanitarian action, how does that resonate with you in the work that you're doing leading the Kenyan Red Cross?
Thank you very much, Sarah. I think, as you rightly say, we are in a very unprecedented times because of the impact of climate change and climate-related disasters. As we speak today, yes, we have the drought, but we also have the flooding that is also happening at the same time. So, which even is another double tragedy, because in the same regions, you may have drought and you have flash floods, but on the other side, you also have the floods, which are also causing a lot of destruction. So we clearly see the difference where nature-based solutions have come into play in terms of reducing the impact. And I want to give an example. For Kenya Red Cross, we have been working in the refugee camp in Dadaab in northern Kenya for the last almost 30 years. And one of the issues that kept on happening there was, of course, the degradation of the land because of the impact of the refugee settlement, cutting trees to be able to get firewood, and that caused quite a bit of devastation. So working together with the communities, the refugee population, but also the host community, to restore this environment, we have seen, a big difference even today when we have the drought, because we've been able to demonstrate that actually this is, a clear way to reduce, to contribute to disaster risk reduction, but also more importantly in terms of food security, because the work that has gone in there, yes, establishment of green belts, which also look at planting of fruit trees. We have almost 104 hectares of land with over 200,000 species of indigenous trees and fruit trees. And you could actually see that the community there is able to sustain itself through some of this work. But just to also say, for Kenya in particular, land and environmental degradation accounts for almost 3% of the GDP loss. So you can see, how significant this is and why it is so important to actually focus on nature-based solutions. And thanks to the partnership we also have with WWF, because we are working, especially in the coastal region, in terms of restoration of mangroves in 2 counties, Kwale and Lamu alone accounts for 60% of the mangrove cover in the country. Again, reduction of the impact of the storms, but more critically is also the livelihood for fisheries. And this is very, very critical. So for us, we really, can identify ourselves with the importance of actually having this nexus, because we can see where this has been done, it has contributed significantly to reducing some of the impact that we see today.
Dr. Asha, I think that last point was so critical. We've seen over the years a lot of success from investments in disaster risk reduction and in early warning. Often the metrics is around lives saved. But this partnership, certainly the work around nature-based solutions is moving beyond just kind of measuring in terms of lives saved, but also really looking at livelihood protection, livelihood support. Valerie, the evidence around the value of investment in adaptation and disaster risk reduction, value of nature-based solutions is quite strong, and yet there's significant underinvestment in this space, even though, again, the potential to avert loss is quite significant. I'm wondering if you could speak to how the World Bank is thinking about investments in this space, as well as potential for private sector partnership in this space.
No, thank you, Sarah. It's amazing we're having this conversation and celebrating this really important partnership when this is something we should have been doing 30 years ago. Because the evidence is clear. Environment is either a source of conflict or has funded conflict and fragility and disaster more than most other causes. Between 1946, since the end of the Second World War, and 2010, 40% of all conflict was caused or funded by the environment. So there is an integral relationship between fragility, conflict, disaster, and the environment. So it's wonderful that we're finally getting to the point of recognizing it as not just part of the problem, but it can be a hugely important solution. When it comes to thinking about finance, at the World Bank we think about it in 3 ways: quantity, access, and quality. Quantity is often a political issue. Who's willing to put money on the table? But more importantly are the issues of access and quality. And access is really all around who gets the money. And Nina and I had a quick chat before we came on stage, and it's all around this last mile question. There's so much money flowing, but I've heard, we've all heard in panel after panel here in the negotiations, that the people on the ground at the coal face of the impacts of climate change and fragility and disaster, whether they're sudden onset disasters, slow onset disasters, or indigenous peoples, local communities, they're often women because their husbands or fathers have left already to go to a city to get a job somewhere else. And they're exactly the people who aren't getting access to the climate money, no matter how much is on the table. And so thinking about who gets money, and it's not just direct access and having these formal conversations. It's not just about supply, it's about demand. So one of the things we're working at in the World Bank is how do we make sure we build up indigenous people and local community organizations so that they have the level of formalization, and the implementation record to access money that is available. Because money can't just go anywhere. It has to go into an organization that can manage the money, report on it, and implement it for results. And so one of our jobs to ensure that there's more access is to build up those organizations. And in the short term, it's working with groups like the IFRC, it's working with groups like WWF as intermediaries. So that in the short term, the money, a big pot of money can go into an intermediary who can split it into smaller pots that can go to those smaller organizations. And in turn, that money comes with technical assistance. And one of the changes we're making to make sure this sticks, because we've been doing this for a long time and we wonder why is it not sticking? It's because too often the intermediary never went away. There was no sunset clause. And there's the idea that basically forever an intermediary would help the smaller organizations, so the smaller organizations never needed to mature and grow up. And now we're putting in sunset clauses. We're saying as part of the results for an intermediary is we want to be able to directly fund those small and medium-sized Indigenous peoples and local community organizations. But the second piece is quality. And quality is all about justice, where the money goes. It's about diversity and it's about impact. And in terms of justice, where the money goes, the bank we invested $32 billion last year in climate finance. Of that, 40% went to Africa, because that's where the money needs to go, and it needs to go on adaptation. Of that 32 billion, half of it was spent on adaptation, because too much of the climate dialogue is around mitigation. Mitigation is market ready. It's cost competitive. It's attracting private sector because it's a money maker. Adaptation isn't a money maker, and nature-based solutions right now aren't money makers. And one of the reasons they're not money makers is because the lack of rules of the game. There are two things we say are necessary to make nature-based solutions a money maker to attract private capital, so we can go from the billions to the trillions, or in the case of nature-based solutions, from the hundreds of thousands to the millions, which is sort of a better scale for nature-based solutions. We need better regulation, and we need more engagement of Indigenous peoples, local communities, on whose land those nature-based solutions are happening. Because without rules of the game, without predictability, private sector isn't going to be able to come in. And they're interested in coming in because, unlike other adaptation solutions, nature-based solutions accept the fact that natural capital is economic capital. The best thing about nature-based solutions is they don't just provide adaptation solutions. The mangroves don't just protect against wave energy in a flood. They provide economic benefits because they're a nursery for fisheries. Your fisheries do better. You can make more money from your fishery. So there is money to be made if it's done right, but only if the predictability is in place and only if the Indigenous peoples and local community are at the table. And we have to work on many different instruments together. We have to have that diversity of instruments. We have to think about grant and loan money, public and private sector money. And we have to think about impact. I think this is one of the missing pieces when it comes to the discussion on nature-based solutions. We know how to measure the development dividend, the jobs or the more revenue from fisheries, for example, for mangroves. We know how to measure the conservation impact. We're not always so good at measuring the adaptation impact. Sarah, you said it's in lost lives avoided. It's a very hard metric. And for ministers of finance, it's not a particularly useful metric because they can't monetize it. So this is really about figuring out the access piece and figuring out, when it comes to the quality of money that's used, how do we measure it and how do we make sure we have the rules of the game and the policy in place to make it work.
Thank you for that, for giving a couple of really helpful specifics to grasp onto. We can open up the floor for questions. If anyone in the audience has a question, maybe you can raise your hand and I'll come out and bring the microphone to you. I'll start asking. Oh, we have one here.
Hello. Okay, thank you so much. My name is Bowen Banda. I'm also from WWF, but I'm quite new in WWF. And it's such a coincidence that what you're discussing is also my areas of specialization, both DRR as a separate degree and climate change as a separate degree. And what I'm trying to say is I've liked this, and I made sure I attended this meeting. I've liked this conversation because even like what you've said, that this conversation was supposed to have started about 30 years ago. And having worked at grassroots level for many years and done research, this is exactly what is happening on the ground. From the people's perspective, to them, climate change adaptation and DRR are one and the same things, especially if you are going to define them using the local language. They use the same terminologies, same examples, same everything. And to be part of WWF at this point, it's a big privilege, and to see that WWF is also trying to link up with the International Federation of the Red Cross and try to demonstrate the marriage, or demonstrate that these terminologies or concepts are similar and we need to do something about it, is highly recommendable. And personally, I'm very excited, and that's why I'm here to be part of this wonderful history. Yeah, thank you.
That's great. And maybe while I'm moving a microphone over here, Dr. Asha, we've heard these are conversations that probably should have happened 30 years ago. And I'm wondering, from your vantage point in Kenya, what do you see as some of the what have you seen as some of the barriers, and how can we be working again to make sure that those resources are really getting to communities where they're most needed, that the knowledge, expertise, and support, and then we'll come right here for a question after that.
No, thank you, Sarah, for that question. For me, one of the challenges is also about leadership, the political will, and also some of the frameworks that can be put in place to ensure this happens. And again, I'll give an example. In Kenya today, and I would say currently, we have the leadership from the government, which is clearly bringing every stakeholder together and saying, this is something that we all need to do and to contribute, and therefore creating a platform where everyone can contribute. The last so many years, yes, there's been a lot also that has been going on. It's not that it hasn't been happening, but it's been, in a way you can say, disjointed, where everyone is trying to do what they can at their different corners. But how do you bring that together in order to be able to scale it up? Having that coordination, but more importantly, involving the communities themselves, because communities are the biggest contributors, if we are honest about even what we are talking about. I mentioned what we do in Dadaab. It's the refugee population there, it's the host community that are actually doing this, and we are facilitating and giving the guidance. There's also the question of policy frameworks, an issue like mangroves. Yes, the conversation should be there and tries to be there, but when you have policies also from governments that go against this, it also becomes a bottleneck for all the good intentions that communities or organizations like us also can do. So I think that conducive environment for, first of all, to recognize, which I think that's where we are. Probably it's also by default that we have found ourselves in such a situation that we are looking for any solution that we can get to get ourselves from the mess that we are in today. So we are compelled to actually drastically do something about it, and therefore somehow we find ourselves all coming together to discuss this. But I think that for me would be one of the bottlenecks. And then of course the question of funding. Yes, there's been funding, but sometimes not enough, and even more critically, it is short-term. And we have many examples of funding for nature-based solutions that is just integrated into another project as a by the way. And I have the experience where when donors have to cut or partners have to cut, even in that integrated program, the first thing they will remove is the environmental issues. And they'll say, we'll cut on this and then we'll continue with the rest. And so it's always the easier one to put aside. So funding, that recognition that it's critical, the policy framework, the leadership, especially for national governments, because it is so critical that it has to be led also at the national level, because that's also the only way it can be sustainable. Thank you.
Dr. Asha is being very polite as I sit here as one of the funders that's been in that situation of probably not giving long-term enough funding and probably asking to scale back. So I definitely have my instructions going back. We can take a question here, and then I think Valerie wanted to jump in. Actually, why don't we take two questions? Oh, wonderful. We'll take two questions, and then we'll come back to Valerie, and then get to the third question.
Thank you so much, all of you. I'm Rami from the Egyptian Red Crescent, from the same family. So it's not a question, it's just I wanted to highlight some important thing. We as an International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Society have our own early warning system, because that I heard many about many discussions speak about the early warning system and the importance. It's also a part of the disaster risk reductions. We have expertise on the movement. We have our early warning system that deal with the community, come up of the messages. We have our community leader. So we already have our own system that exists in 192 different national societies. And for sure it varies from one context to another context. So we are raising our voice to scale up, to invest in what we have already. And this is, I think, that will come up also with some of the natural-based solution that we are talking about. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Hi, Alfred from Fiji. I also work for WWF, but based in the WWF Pacific. I just wanted to, my question is, so we work in about 21 villages in Fiji, part of a group of communities that we work with, and as part of climate adaptation, we had actually worked with the community to develop their disaster risk reduction plan. 21 villages, 21 different disaster risk reduction plan, but a very common element is that their sustainable fisheries management plan, their forestry management plan, their sustainable land use plan for the community is a big component of their disaster risk reduction plan. And disaster preparedness is the most important component of their plan. And it kind of links directly to the topic of the side event that we're discussing, but one of the biggest challenges that we face is that scaling up such best practices to other communities within the same area and also across the small island developing states. So even though the project has come to an end, we're still actively looking for, for funding to be able to scale up the activity at a pace and at a scale that is needed. And so one of the challenges, and my question is that how can we ensure that we address the bureaucratic red tapes that are in place in terms for us to be able to access funding, that to be able to scale up best practices at the local level at the scale that is needed.
Yeah, that's a really helpful question. So maybe if we could take one more, but while...
Hello, hi. Thank you so much for your input. I think my question is directed to Valerie Hickey. So I actually work at one of the implementation units for the World Bank in St. Martin. So the World Bank manages funds for disaster risk after the fact, for reconstructing and rebuilding after Hurricane Irma. And so we call ourselves actually not a PMU, but a PMO, because we are an organization. A lot of us are from St. Martin and have that local expertise, which is really was one of the intentions of the bank. But when you talk about, you brought up some really amazing points when you're looking about adaptation. And right now we're focusing a lot of our projects on rebuilding. And adaptation within the scope of those projects is never really integrated when it could be. And that's because of certain policies within the frameworks of the bank. And, I feel like there could be more flexibility when we're looking at kind of hitting two birds with one stone. So my question is that, when you work in the local context, some of the challenges I've faced to deliver that aid, that impact, and see the nexus between nature-based solutions, disaster risk reduction, and climate change adaptation has been these documents and scopes and lines of projects. And also, while ESF, or the environmental social framework, has been flexible, we still have to produce so many documents until we can actually implement the project. And the timeline of those projects become from 1 year to 2 year just for the documents alone. And someone who's writing those project proposals, sometimes I get really frustrated with this iteration of back and forth. And I think in the end, my question is, how do you see that process being streamlined so that we can do exactly what you said, deliver that aid and have that impact in the small islands and where you have your projects?
So I think I'll come to Valerie, because I think that last question hit upon what we all struggle with in terms of operating in this nexus, which is how to overcome some of these very siloed approaches, which can sometimes manifest itself in lots of projectized and very bureaucratic processes. And maybe if you could also touch upon scale, and then I'll come to Marco and Nina after that.
I think we've learned a lot at the World Bank in the past 7 or 8 years with the speed of disaster that's been happening. And we used to be an institution that saw our role only as reconstruction. So, you know, in Afghanistan, our role was the Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund in St. Martin, which is a different case because it's part of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. We're only working on reconstruction. And since then, we really are much more engaged in prevention, making sure we're remaining engaged through partners during conflict and during disaster so that we don't step away, and helping countries transition out of disaster mode, because often that's the most dangerous time, when the humanitarian organizations step out, if it takes too long for the development organizations to step in. So we are trying, and one of the reasons we don't want to just focus on reconstruction is that in the moment when people don't have a roof over their head, and this was the case in St. Martin after Hurricane Irma, having a discussion around making sure your roof is hurricane proof, and having a discussion around, should it be category 5 proof, should it be category 4 proof, because it makes a difference both in terms of cost and time. It makes a difference in terms of who does it. Can't really be local engineers anymore. Now it has to be foreign engineers at a category 5, whatever it is. When someone doesn't have a roof over their head, that seems like a very academic discussion. And that's the problem with having discussions around adaptation after the fact. People need a roof over their head and they need it faster. So I hear you, and this is something we're working on. The other issue on this boom and bust of project finance is something the World Bank has finally figured out too, is that we shouldn't be in the business of financing green projects. We should be in the business of financing green economies and locally financing green ways of life, so that it isn't a project that comes in and goes away. Because we have wasted so much money where we do these wonderful projects that have great results, and then the project goes away and the results go away just as quickly. And communities and Indigenous peoples deserve better. But I did want to ask a question of my group, because one of the things, I'm an ex-Panda, I'm an ex-WWFer. Like so many people in the world, WWF was where we apprenticed. I remember working in Rwanda, and there was real mistrust between local communities and WWF at the time and other conservation organizations, because local communities, in this case the Batwa community, thought we cared more about the gorillas than we cared about them. Given this partnership, I'm really interested in understanding, how did you overcome that trust deficit so that local communities don't think this is a Trojan horse to take care of the gorillas, that it is actually about communities too?
And maybe, Marco, I'll add another question to that. I think some of these questions are all getting at how do we move from a very projectized approach to this, which is, you know, necessarily kind of limited in time, scale, and impact, to a real longer-term partnership that actually is sustainable.
Yeah, so first of all, on the gorilla thing, I invite you to go back to Rwanda now because the gorilla-based economy, local economy, is unbelievable. And as you know, that issue is now completely gone. In fact, to the contrary. But look, I think some of the comments were really super interesting and sparked two quick reflections. So first of all, I also agree completely on the accessibility of funding. The issue that was earlier, it's a super important point, and really here is the donor community really need to try to continue to strike the balance between the necessary compliance mechanism requirements versus actually making sure that this resources can get to the ground. Completely agree with you on the intermediaries. Our job is to make ourselves redundant in a project in order to begin another one and have a bigger impact scale over time. But my main reflection is this. When we talk about nature-based solutions, we should be careful not to think that these are solutions that we suddenly invent and deploy to a landscape. Nature-based solutions were there before. They disappeared because of a number of reasons. And so one of the problems in maintaining, if you like, the permanence over long term and the benefits of nature-based solutions is not actually analyzing the root causes that drove the degradation of the environment that then completely alienate and eroded the ability of nature to provide those solutions, to provide those services. Classic example is mangrove plantation. If we do invest in coastal protection through mangrove plantation, I've done this myself firsthand, without addressing the issue of energy access and the solutions for the communities around the mangrove plantations, by the time the mangroves are 2 meters high, they will be cut down for charcoal. And so we need to take an holistic approach, looking at the root causes on why those solutions that were there before, why nature that was present before disappeared, and tackle this issue with a more comprehensive plan to address what you said, local economy development in a way that allows those nature-based solutions to be truly sustainable, truly permanent, and truly recognized as a benefit to the local communities. So I've seen too often very single kind of pointed solution and projects that were not taking care of the actual entire set of needs of that particular community in that particular environment.
Thank you. Maybe Nina, if you want to reflect upon the same.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to disclose that I worked for 25 years in the World Bank Group. So great to see Valerie here. And now I work for this largest humanitarian network, community-based network in the world. So I wanted to connect the dots from my perspective. Valerie, it's absolutely great to hear such a strong financing that comes from the World Bank, the 36 billion that you mentioned. But I can also say that from our perspective, we at the local community level, even though we have local actors, well-established organizations, our national societies, we do not see that funding flow. The global number is that only 10% of the funding for climate adaptation reaches actually local level. And then when you look at the nature-based solutions, and correct me when I'm wrong, I was shocked to realize that only 1% of financing goes to nature-based solutions, and then very little from the private sector, as you said. So we know the problem, but we do not actually have a solution, and I really like the point on the common terminology or mechanisms. For a person in local community, it doesn't matter whether this is the funding is coming from development or humanitarian budgets, from USAID, from the World Bank, or local private sector. For that person, it doesn't matter whether it's a response or resilience, right? They live in that community, and they're the first one to act and to prepare and to respond and to restore. And I just want to bring the conversation back to those people about whom we are talking here. And my sense, Sarah, is we have to work on mechanisms to connect really these different pots of financing, because we haven't found an effective mechanism to bring private sector in general to humanitarian area. We humanitarians are working also on the resilience, so it crosses a little bit to development, so we need support of humanitarian parts of various governments and donors to connect us with the development parts. I would focus ourselves over the next year or so on finding those mechanisms, some blended finance models. We're talking about grants when we talk about support to communities, right? I think Valerie is probably talking about loans and concessional loans to the government. So terminology and mechanisms, in my mind, is something that we need to address so that we don't talk in an abstract, that we talk about practical financial mechanisms. And I cannot resist but not mentioning that the idea behind the Global Climate Resilience Platform that IFRC just launched last week, and the USAID is the seed investor in that capital with $20 million. It will go up to $1 billion for 5 years to support millions of local communities, and nature-based solutions are one part of it, is exactly there to help us with implementation of some of these funding mechanisms. This is not for one partner to finance or even to implement. It is for many partners to pull their best effort together and come up with those financing mechanisms that will ultimately support the people that I talked about.
Looking to see if we have any more questions from the audience. One more.
It's not a question, it's just an addition. I think we should repeat this presentation next year. The reason is it takes time for others who are not in this business to understand this nexus. And the other challenge is we've come from separate backgrounds. For climate change adaptation, specialists are coming from environmental sciences, and the DRR are coming from humanitarian sciences, social sciences. So the policymakers out there, a good number of them don't understand this nexus. And here we are at the COP, you find that we are more inclined to climate change adaptation. So even when you bring in DRR, others start wondering, why are you bringing this issue when we are at the UNCCC COP? So I would really recommend that come next year in Dubai or in Abu Dhabi, this topic, we repeat it. Thank you.
We'll put in a plug with the WWF Pavilion next year in Abu Dhabi to host a follow-up conversation. I think it's a really good point about, I come primarily from the humanitarian space where we talk a lot about disaster risk reduction. Our counterparts are often ministries of civil protection and their kind of municipal counterparts. The adaptation space is often ministries of environment. Dr. Asha, I'm wondering, you spoke about one of the changes you've seen under the new government in Kenya is kind of a bringing together of a number of different ministries around this set of issues. Any reflections from this discussion on, again, practically speaking, how things need to work differently in order for us to have a different kind of conversation next year and 5 years from now?
Thank you. Maybe just a follow-up to what my brother here said, let's not wait for COP28 to continue this conversation. I think it's actually more critical before COP28 that we continue with this conversation. And we must say that today already I feel it's a big step, because already we have so many people in this room, because usually in the past, when people start to talk about nature-based solutions, then we have many people walking out because then it's not so interesting, or they don't maybe see the importance. But I think we've gained the momentum, and so for me it's very critical that in between even the next COP, what are some of the mechanisms? And again, maybe to my two colleagues here, what can we do in between these big meetings to ensure this conversation and the knowledge you're saying actually continues? But it's also critical, I think, to be able to bring the practices, to share some of the lessons learned. We have, yes, the different projects that have been done, but in order for us to be able to scale this up, we also need to be able to bring this together so that then we can be able to learn the lessons and then see what we need to do to actually be able to scale up. We also have opportunities, I think, like Valerie said. For me, the private sector I see is critical. And so how do we bring more and more of the private sector into play? Sometimes on a light note, I usually tease some of my colleagues and say, because of what is happening, businesses will not have people to buy their products. So it is also in their own interest to ensure that communities are safe and are thriving, for also their businesses to thrive. And we've seen many of them now also coming forward and saying, yeah, not only just as, and not as part of their CSR, but it's because it's a priority issue. not just a way of saying that, yeah, we are contributing to something, but it is a priority for business, it's a priority for private sector, and therefore putting in substantial amounts of money and even technical expertise for those who have it to ensure this happens. So I think for me, these are some of maybe the critical issues, and I think, again, those coordination platforms for us with this partnership, I think we have already a platform that we can actually take to scale. And as Nena said, and Dr. Rami there said, 192 National Red Cross and Red Crescent societies globally is a huge community. And so what can we also then do together with WWF, World Bank, USAID, and others to be able then to take this to another level? Maybe away from really just on the nature-based solutions, but in terms of partnership, I also felt it was good to also share some of the work we've done with WWF in Kenya. Apart from on the nature-based solutions, somebody mentioned the question of preparedness. And we've been able to support some local governments to put up emergency operations centers to be able to anticipate, be able to predict also some of these emergencies, because I think it's important to have that full cycle supported, because if we only just do vertical interventions in the end, then we may not really achieve the solutions we are looking for. So I thought good to also say that, yes, apart from this, there are also opportunities on preparedness, and we have the experience to work together on something like that. Thank you.
So, Dr. Asha, you've given us a good kind of closing question for each of the rest of the panels, maybe a two-parter, and you can choose which ones you want to respond to, everyone else on the panel. One question is, what does scale look like? How are you thinking when we look out 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now, what that looks like? And then the other question Dr. Asha mentioned was kind of what's our homework between now and the next COP. So I leave it to you which one of those questions you want to answer, but maybe we can start with you, Valerie, and then come to Nina and Marco.
So one thing that I think is key when it comes to scale is normalizing finance in communities around disasters. That means making sure that while we have early warning systems, we have also early commitment that money will be there to help communities rebuild when it happens. We need to move away from just thinking about disasters as needing humanitarian money, and that means having more penetration of insurance markets and making sure that people have access to insurance. Insurance is something that is so key. Many of us depend on it. If something goes wrong, we know we have insurance, we'll be okay. If you don't have that, it makes a difference, and that's why we're helping build in places where either insurance is unaffordable, we're helping close that gap so people can afford it. Where it's unavailable, we're helping invent that insurance for small-scale fishers, for small-scale farmers, for people who live on the margins, who need, when they lose their livelihood because of a disaster, when they lose their assets, they're able to get them back. So for me, that's part of scale, together with making sure that local banks know how to get involved in the sector. When we think about private sector, too often in these sorts of arenas, we mean big companies, capital markets. We need to be working with local banks so that they're making loans available to many small and medium-sized enterprises who want to use natural capital as economic capital. And so you get that triple win of development dividends, growth, jobs, money, income, as well as adaptation and nature conservation.
You're welcome to add anything else you might. I thought you gave us a good jumping off point for the closing.
Yeah. No, I don't think I have much more to add except to say that, again, let's not forget the communities themselves. I think there's a lot of potential there that we are not tapping enough, and so my last word is really to say let's work with communities. And I think, as we said, it's not new. These are also things that they have been doing over time, and there may be reasons why we have found ourselves in the situations we are. So they have a lot of local knowledge. They also have practices that we can also bring on board. So again, communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Asha, and I agree with that and everything that Valerie said. When we talk about the scaling up, if the percentage that I gave, 1% of total climate finance goes to nature-based solutions, then I think really any multiplier of that would really be a good objective. And partnerships absolutely with WWF, but also with the World Bank, other funds, and in particular private sector will need to be developed. It would be good to do a similar session, Sarah, next year on this, and have a private sector participant with us to hear a little bit from their perspective why the money is not flowing through insurance companies and what are those mechanisms that they would need to see in place, including from us, in order to making larger amounts of money coming in. Thank you.
But to your question about the future of the partnership, for me, it's pretty clear that now we need to translate that partnership on the ground, in places, with communities, and address some of the challenges and capitalize some of the opportunities that we discussed today. This is really the next step. We're already working on the ground in a few countries, Zambia, Pakistan, we're discussing Kenya. But the partnership is all about impact on the ground, and that will be the next phase and next focus for sure. And in a year's time, we should actually come back and report on what we've been able to deliver on the ground and how we've been able to address and maybe find solution to some of the challenges that we discussed today.
Well, I think we have commitment to a version of this panel next year where we're talking not just about the potential of the partnership, the potential of this work, but hopefully highlighting some impacts that we're already starting to see on the ground, and like Dr. Asha said, a reminder of kind of the centrality of communities in the design, the ownership, and the sustainability of this kind of partnership. Thank you all for a very lively session, and particularly for all of you that participated in this session today.
One more